currently a postdoc working at Northwestern University. I am not at Colgate. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, Ed was unable to make it, so I was asked to fill in. And I'm really excited to be here to be speaking to you alongside some incredibly talented speakers, so it's really an honor. My talk today is entitled Beyond the Fingerpad, Extending Robot Perception Through Vibrations. So just a little bit about myself before we get started. So I got my master's at New York University, where I was studying acoustics and psychoacoustics. So I was working on how sounds propagate through space and how humans localize those sounds in 3D space. After that, I did my Ph.D. at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I worked with Professor Jan Gazelle. Unfortunately, I swear these videos are really clean on my computer, but I think it's the mirroring, so we're going to deal with it. But I worked on elastodynamics. So I worked on how solid objects, how waves propagate through solid objects, including the human hand. And I also spent a lot of time working on surface haptics and designing new types of devices to surface haptic devices. And currently I'm a postdoc at Northwestern working with Professor Ed Colgate, where I'm working on tactile sensing for robotics, and I'm using sort of new methods such as ultrasound in order to understand contacts that are happening with the robots, between the robot and the environment. So I just want to give you a quick talk overview. In this talk, I'm actually going to argue that we need vibration sensing in order to move robotics to its next. We need high-resolution vibration sensing in order to have robots understand their environment. And so, nearly all task-oriented objectives for robots require grasping an object and interfacing with the environment through that object. And to me, these interactions fall under tool-mediated haptics, or tool-mediated touch. And so, in the first part of this talk, I'm going to tell you about how the human hand evolved to wield, master, and manipulate tools so that we could understand the environment through them. Then I'm going to talk to you about wave propagation in the skin, and how when we make contacts with the environment, waves propagate throughout our entire hand and are sensed by a population of receptors. Next, I'll detail how tools are taken into the body representation of itself in order to become a sensory extension, and how vibration dynamics are required in order to understand what's happening at the tool interface boundary. And then finally, I'm going to detail vibration sensing for robots, and how we can move towards learning models of vibration dynamics in order to have robots understand and make inferences about the environment through grasped objects. And then time permitting, I'll describe some of my current unpublished research. So part one, a hand evolved for tool use. So tools act as sensory extensions of our bodies, and I would argue that the skill and dexterity that we're able to manipulate tools is sort of one of the pinnacles of human achievement. So we're able to draw with incredible precision and create artworks that are typically cited as one of the pinnacles of human achievement, of cultural achievement as a species. I don't really know what the text is there for. I put up a Swiss tennis player. I know we're in Germany, so it's a little bit offensive, but the skill and dexterity that we're able to use a tennis racket is really quite impressive to witness. And then with respect to music, we use these tools like the bow of a violin or a drumstick in order to express ourselves musically, it's a really complex process, and the tool becomes a part of our body when we're performing these interactions. And so if you talk with experts, they'll often tell you that this tool feels really like it's part of their body. And so I asked ChatGPT to give us a little inspiration for today's talk. And so if you're a little squeamish, please don't look. But this is what it came up with. So this is the tool blending into the arm. The arm and the tool are no longer independent entities, they're one and the same. And it's really, really grotesque. And I think this one is actually pretty good. So where does the tool end, and where does the body begin? And so we're actually going to start with a little experiment. And so we're actually going to get up. I know everyone just sat down, but what we're going to do is I'm going to hand out some pens, And you're going to use these objects to sense the world. And I want you to split up into maybe groups of like 3 or so, with and without your eyes closed. You should touch different surfaces, use different parts of the tool, different grasps. And I really want you to pay attention to the sensations that are happening and where you feel like those sensations are occurring in space. I know it sounds a little weird, but please, we're not gonna stay in this room. Let's walk around a little bit, grab 2 or 3 people, pass these pens around.
Are those pens special?
They're not special.
So we could use our own pens.
But I like some of them better than others.
Or you want them back?
No. Some of these feel really good, so I actually think using different implements can be quite useful here, because you might realize that using some part of the object feels better than using other parts of the object. And we're going to explore why that is in today's talk. So please, let's get up and let's walk around a little bit. Split off. If you don't have a pen, I have many pens here. If you do have pens, you can use your own pens. And do it with another person and talk to them about the sensations that you're experiencing. Where in space is a really, really experience. The sense of location was always placed at the contact location, so between the tip of the object and the environment. Yes? Or you have a question?
No.
Yeah. So I find this really peculiar, right? Because there's absolutely no receptors at that location, and yet your brain is telling you that contact is happening away from the body, extended into space. And so I think tool use is quite fascinating, and humans have had a very long history of tool use. So around 2.6 million years ago, we see the beginning of perhaps one of the first tools for primitive humans, which is these Oldemon flakes. So basically how these were made is using a process called napping. And so you take one stone in one hand, a stone in the other hand, and you hit this rock in order to flake off pieces of the rock. And if you hit it correctly, you can flake off really nice pieces that are used for cutting or scraping. So these were sort of some of the first primitive tools that humans would use. And then around 1.7 years ago, we see the development of the Australian core. And so this was quite distinct from the Oldemon flakes. So instead of flaking off using the flakes from a rock, they instead took a rock and hammered it and removed flakes. So it was a subtractive process in order to get to a bilaterally symmetric face. And so they would strike at one side, reposition, remanipulate the object, strike again at the other side, in order to get this bilaterally symmetric face that had really, really good edge regularity. About 300,000 years ago, there was the development of a new technique called the Levallois. I'm not French, so hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Levallois core, which was an extra step of strategic planning in designing tools. So these ones were made by having a big circular tool that they would nap on all sides, so all the way around, with really, really high precision, so that they had a flat face. And then they would take one strike, and it would release the entirety of that top face from the rest of the rock, and you ended up with a very, very fine edge. And then they would retouch them into these very, very beautiful tool heads. And then about 60,000 years ago, we see the development of microliths, which are these very, very fine precision tools that are around a few millimeters to a few centimeters. And so this required very, very high levels of fingertip precision in order to craft these. Then they would turn these small tool heads into composite objects, like using it for darts or arrows or spears. So what sort of allowed us to get from one point to the other point? Well, if we take a look and compare the human hand to our primate ancestors and to early hominids, we see a number of improvements. I'm just going to highlight a couple that are really important for human dexterous manipulation. So the first one was the enlargement of the apical tuft. So these are at the tips of the fingers. So these are bony protrusions at the tip of the finger that extend slightly past your distal phalanges. And because they became enlarged, it allowed us to have this much more flat volar finger pad surface when compared with chimpanzees, who have a much more cylindrical finger, which allows us to have, as Roland has taught us, gives us higher contact surface area with an object. Probably most important is the development of the thumb, which most people cite as really what separates us from our primate ancestors, our primate cousins. And so the thumb grew relative to the other fingers. And it also had a number of other structural changes to the joint and bones in order to allow higher loads to go through the thumb, and so it could sustain higher loads for longer periods of time. Third was the reduced phalangeal curvature. So if you look at chimpanzees, they have a very, very curved phalanges, whereas humans, we have slight curvature of our phalanges, but it's relatively straight compared to what you find in our primate cousins. This one, I actually found out when I was researching for this talk, was a really interesting one, which is mid-carpal stability. So what this is that at the connection between the metacarpal and the distal carpal row on the hand, there is what's called a styloid projection. So there's a small piece of bone that protrudes out in order for these two bones to lock together in almost a puzzle piece. And that actually stiffens up the palm in order to allow higher palmar loads, specifically through the center of the palm. So this is at mid-carpal 3. You see this styloid process that formed. And then the last one is mobility of digits 4 and 5. So ulnar mobility is actually partly because of the joint connection between the carpal and metacarpal. And we saw the evolution of an improved joint structure that allowed us to cup objects much more effectively. And so this actually allowed us to, so you might be familiar with these two graphs if you're familiar with grasp taxonomies. This is a power grasp on the left and a precision grasp on the right. And while the grasp taxonomy literature has sort of given us a richer picture of all the different types of grasp, there are still two primary grasps that people generally converge on, and these were sort of evolved. We're able to use them effectively because of those evolutions that we saw in the last slide. And so if you're looking at the power grip, this longer thumb allows you to oppose these fingers more effectively, and then the mobility of digits 4 and 5 allows you to cup a cylinder very effectively. And then that mid-carpal stability supports higher palmar loads while you're doing a hammer grip. And then with respect to precision grip, the apical tufts, the broadening of them, is really important for being able to get a good frictional surface to grasp the object. And then that thumb is also really important for opposing the other digits. So these hand adaptations didn't just happen randomly. So they evolved because of the way that we were using our hands. So I actually think this work is really, really interesting. So they placed a series of force sensors on participants' hands and then had them perform a number of primitive operations like cracking nuts, doing napping, and also generating flakes and using a hand axe. And first off, what they found was that napping, this process of generating tools, actually created the highest stresses and forces along the whole hand. And the thumb, DP1, the distal part of the thumb, is actually what is experiencing the most load through it during these primitive operations. And I also thought it was quite interesting that the pinky, the distal end of the pinky, is what's subjected to the highest variation in forces through it. And so it's quite a flexible digit for us that's doing many things in many different types of tasks. And so, if you're hitting rocks for 2.6 million years, it's not surprising that you would have epigenetic and genetic changes in the hand in order to support these types of operations. And so we do find that as we move from the really primitive tools to the more modern or the more complex tools, we see a change in the hand morphology. So around 2.6 million years ago, human hands still had a mixture of both primitive and modern traits. And so we saw the thumb was much longer than our primate cousins, but the phalanges were still pretty curved around 2.6 million years ago. Around 1.7 million years ago, we see the improvements in the mid-carpal stability. So that styloid process has started to form, and we see reduced phalangeal curvature. And then around 300 years ago, hand proportions and joint shapes were essentially modern. And so the jump from around 300 years ago to 60,000 years ago really reflects a change in cultural and technical know-how rather than changes in the hardware that's associated with the hand. And so a big takeaway from this is that better tools are selecting for better hands, and then better hands are then unlocking better tools. So there's this feedback loop that's happening, and it's really supported that tool use is pretty important in this process. And so the brain actually reflects this. So two really important areas of the brain for haptics are the motor cortex, which processes outputs so it sends motor commands to different parts of the body, and also the primary somatosensory cortex, which is going to take in information from our receptors and allows us to understand what's happening at different parts of the body. And while it's challenging to sort of understand how the brain evolved over those 2.6 million years ago, we can look at the organization of the brain in modern humans and try to understand how those adaptations are reflected in cortex. And so Penfield was actually the first one to discover this cortical homunculus. So what Penfield did was he cracked open human skulls. They're his friends, no, I'm just kidding. That's unethical to use your friends to look into their brains. But he anesthetized patients, and he directly stimulated the cortex, and then saw which parts of their body were twitching. And he used that to map out the entire primary motor cortex. And what he found was that different body parts were organized spatially along the primary motor cortex, and that if they were nearby in physical space, they would be nearby in cortex as well. But a big thing that he found is that there was an overrepresentation of the hands, the face, and the feet in this process. And we actually find that there are similar trends in the somatosensory cortex as well, in the primary somatosensory cortex as well. And while Penfield's homunculus has sort of evolved since the time that he designed it, or that he found it in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, with new imaging technologies, really the conclusions here are the same, is that we have this overrepresentation of the hands. I think around 1/4 of the motor cortex is associated with motor commands for the hand. And so I hope I've convinced you that both in hardware and in software, that humans are designed for using tools. And the rest of the talk, I'm gonna prove the following points to you. So I'm gonna first prove that vibrations transmit information about events that are happening at the skin to widespread receptors. I'm then gonna convince you that vibrations play an elevated role in tool-mediated touch. And then that predictable vibration dynamics of tools and objects are required for effective tool use. And then I'm going to tell you that inference about the environment through a tool or object is necessary for robot task completion, and that finally we need new methods for learning the vibratory dynamics of objects and tools to improve robot sensing and really take robotics to the next level. So, part 2, ways in the skin. So I don't think I need to explain to participants in a summer school on tactile sensing and processing that tactile sensation is important for object manipulation. But I find that these videos are really satisfying to watch anyway. This is work by Roland Johansson, on which he had participants strike a match. And so this is what it looks like with normal sensation. Very easy, right? No problem. And here is what happens when the participant's hand is anesthetized. So with no sensory function, the participant can barely grasp the object, can barely manipulate it in their hand, can't properly manipulate the object against the part that is trying to strike, or perform the action. And so I think this is a really kind of get your imagination going about how important these sensory receptors are for our manipulation, and why our robots look like this and not like this. They don't look like this right now, unfortunately. So the question is how are we going to get there? So Roland was right. I'm the second person to have a plot on the 4 types of the low threshold mechanoreceptors, and hopefully the others can keep the trend going. So there are 4 types of low threshold mechanoreceptors. They are the Meissner corpuscle, Merkel cells, Pacinian corpuscle, and Ruffini ganglions. And when we have a touch contact interaction, like say grasping an object, thousands of these mechanoreceptors are being activated at any one time, and that information is transduced into neural spike trains, which are then sent up the dorsal column, medial and distal pathway directly into the primary somatosensory cortex S1. And so these receptors have different properties. They're categorized into slowly adapting and rapidly adapting sensory receptors, and so the slowly adapting receptors, if you indent the skin, they'll continue to fire during the indentation, whereas the rapidly adapting receptors really only fire on onset and offset of that contact. They're also categorized in terms of receptive fields. So there's SA1 and RA1, and those will have very, very tiny, highly localized receptive fields. So if you apply a contact at the tip of the fingertip, those receptors, SA1 and RA1, only respond if the receptor is very close to that stimulation location. And then you have SA2 and RA2, which will have receptive fields that will respond to stimulation much farther away from the contact. And you do tend to see this kind of breakup where we want to say that a particular mechanoreceptor is responsible for extracting a particular feature from an object. So I think Roland mentioned that RA1 is typically associated with grip, and that SA1 may be associated with shape. But we know, if we look in cortex, there are not actually RA1-like and SA1-like receptors in primary somatosensory cortex. All of these cortical neurons are taking inputs from each of these submodalities. And so this is a work from Hans Solensling and Betsmaya in 2014, and I highly suggest it because it shows how, or it talks about how touch really is a team effort between all of these different sensory mechanoreceptors. And we might be able to say that, say, shape takes a lot of its information from SA1. That SA1 is the privileged channel, the privileged mechanoreceptor for shape assessment, but all of them are required in order to extract these features from the environment. And so, unsurprisingly, we have the highest density of receptors at our hands, our face, and our feet. And so it's no coincidence that we found an overrepresentation of these specific body parts in cortex. And so these are the body parts that are really, really associated with interfacing with the environment. And so sensory receptors are placed exactly where function is needed. So when we consider a touch interaction, most tactile sensing literature is focused about what happens directly at the contact. And so classical mechanoreceptor responses that we'll find, and we read about in textbooks, are always taken at locations as close to the stimulation location as possible. But this really isn't the whole picture. And so when you contact the environment, actually widespread oscillations are generated throughout the whole hand. And so this is videos from an old lab mate of mine, Tian Xiao, in which he placed 42 different accelerometers on the hand and then had participants perform manual interactions like grasping and tapping while with that accelerometer array on. And so I'll play it one more time real quick. But those waves start at that location where we're making contact, but really spread across the entire hand. And this is a video from my old Ph.D. advisor. That's his hand right here. And this video was actually done using a different methodology, not a set of accelerometers. This was done using a laser Doppler vibrometer. And so what we do is we have a laser, we point it at the hand, we measure the oscillations at that location, and then we move that laser to a different location and perform the same stimulation condition, and then stitch the whole video together. So the video you're going to see takes about an hour to generate. So that happened so fast, but that was an hour of my life taking it. So unfortunately, the video is a little hard to see right here. Let's see if we get a good one.
Greg, is it the underside of the hand or the backside?
So,
is that a left hand or right hand?
So this was the backside, and then this is the palmar surface. Okay. So this was like this, and we stimulated here at the tip.
Tapping Jan's finger there.
In line, yeah, and watching the vibrations happen. And this one's really nice. This is a 3-axis scanning laser Doppler vibrometry system. So we're getting 3-axis skin oscillations, which normally these systems are.
Can we see it one more time? Thank you.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's 60 frames on my computer, so unfortunately. Okay, so these vibrations or oscillations are carrying information about the contact events that elicited them. So in this work by Delhay, a finger was scanned across the textured surface, and they measured at the wrist. And what they found was that the frequency information that was specific to a texture was preserved all the way up to the wrist. And so you might say, Greg, that information is there at the wrist, but does it actually matter? Is the brain using it for anything? And so in a different study by Lieboutin and co-authors, they actually anesthetized the participant's finger and had them perform roughness discrimination tasks. And what they found was that even though your finger from here upward is completely anesthetized, you're still able to judge the roughness of different textures. And so that tells us that those widespread oscillations that we're generating during that contact interaction can be readily used and are readily used by the brain in order to infer things about what's happening at the fingertip. And I guess it's a spoiler, but you can think of this as kind of like our tool example, right? You have the tool here, and it doesn't have any sensory receptors on it, just like your finger here is completely anesthetized, and you're still able to have normal sensory function.
Really normal? As good as
sorry,
normal?
normal was a incorrect word.
So decent. Better than chance, right?
Yeah. You can perform roughness discrimination. That's what I'll say. So I'm just going to touch on one of my own works real quick. So in this work, we actually stimulated the hand with this ear-coupled ultrasound device. So this is a device that uses focused ultrasound at around 40 kilohertz to deliver tactile sensations to the hand. So you focus ultrasound energy to the hand, and actually you can feel it, but it's not because it's at 40 kilohertz, it's because there's a nonlinear interaction between the focused ultrasound and the hand that causes low-frequency vibrations in the skin. And so what we did with this device is that we scanned it really fast across the hand. And this is, I don't know if you see the resemblance, but this one's my hand. And so when we scan this ultrasound, really fast speeds across the hand. So this is 11 meters per second, so the stimuli happens in around 10 to 15 milliseconds. We saw these shock fronts forming in the skin. And that was because we were actually sweeping this focused ultrasound source faster than the sound barrier in the hand. So waves propagate in the hand around sub 10 meters per second. And so when we break that sound barrier, we get these large wave formations that follow behind this focused ultrasound stimulation. And to link the formation of these shock fronts to perception, we performed a behavioral task in which we asked participants to identify the direction of this ultrasound scan as we moved it either from the wrist to the fingertip or from the fingertip to the wrist. And so chance percentage here would be 50%. They're unable to identify which direction we applied that scan and focus ultrasound source. What we found was that as the length of that wake and shock fronts started to form in the skin, that behavioral accuracy tanked to around 50%. And so what this told us was that tissue biomechanics was really constraining this particular stimulation device. And so what we want to do with this device is generate really localized sensations. But because of the way that the skin is distributing energy to large parts of the hand, you're really unable to do it with this kind of device. So let's do another quick experiment. This one's in chair, okay? So we don't have to go anywhere. So I'm going to ask you to put the back of your hand to your ear like this. So hand out, rotate back to your ear. Then you're going to take your other finger, and then you're going to. You should hear a zipping sound in your ear. So you really need to put it to your ear. Are people hearing a zipping sound?
No.
So those are those widespread vibrations that you can even hear at the wrist because they're so prevalent. So we were really interested in sort of how does this, like, what does the propagation look like in the hand? What are the properties of the hand and its morphology that are going to be affecting those vibrations as they travel? Because it's not the exact same signal that we see at the fingertip. It's going to be some filtered version of that input. And so what we did was we used that same laser vibrometry technique in order to measure vibrations all across the hand to different frequencies of input. And so what we found was that at really low frequencies, so 20 hertz to around 100 hertz, oscillations traveled tens of centimeters away from that contact location. And interestingly enough, it was not monotonic with distance. You might think that energy just sort of decays as you get away from the contact location. But actually, because of some of the anatomical structure of the hand, we actually saw amplification at 20 hertz around the knuckle. And then at these higher frequencies, we actually see that waves are concentrated near the location of the stimulus and have the classic property of sort of decaying with distance that you would expect for a viscoelastic material. And so the properties, the biomechanical filtering properties of the hand are both a function of viscoelasticity and also the morphology of the hand. And so this is quite similar to what the cochlea does when it decomposes an incoming sound wave. And so the cochlea, when you put a sound wave, when the ear transduces a sound wave, the cochlea will decompose that frequency information into different locations along the cochlea. So right at the entryway of the cochlea, you'll find 20 hertz oscillation, and towards the base of the cochlea, you'll see 200 hertz oscillation. And so the cochlea is performing a frequency-to-place transform such that essentially the ear is performing a Fourier transform for us, right? So it's taking frequency information, decomposing it into space, which allows the auditory nerve fibers that are attached or that are connected to the cochlea to be easily encoded. So it is a preneuronal mechanism to simplify the signals to be encoded by the nerves, by the afferents. And in this work, we actually found that the skin is doing something very, very similar. And so those skin oscillations that are widespread are going to be transduced into spiky responses by these highly sensitive Pacini corpuscles. And so the Pacini corpuscle actually has a very unique encoding strategy for stimuli. So if you put a sinusoid into the hand and you are measuring PC responses, it'll exhibit what's called entrainment. And so it will fire once per cycle of that sinusoidal stimulus. And so often you'll see PCs characterized by an entrainment threshold curve. So this is a very old work from 1984 where they measured PC responses to generate entrainment threshold curves. And the way you read this is that each point here is the amplitude of the displacement, not velocity or acceleration, the displacement of an input sinusoid that will generate entrainment for the PC at that particular frequency. And so you see down here, this is peak sensitivity for the Pacini corpuscle. It requires somewhere between 10 nanometers and 100 nanometers of input displacement to get entrainment in the PC. And these are 4 different PCs that are located near to the stimulus. And they all have very, very canonical sensitivity curves where you have increasing sensitivity up to around 300 hertz, and then decreasing sensitivity beyond 300 hertz. And so in this same work, we used our measurements of skin oscillations to drive a computational model of PCs. And so due to biomechanical filtering, when we input a diharmonic stimulus, so 50 hertz and 100 hertz, into the fingertip, because of biomechanical filtering, you'll get different contributions of 50 hertz and 100 hertz at different locations on the hand, with 50 hertz being more prevalent further from the contact, and 100 hertz more prevalent closer to the contact because of damping. And then if you throw in that PC model, what we actually find is that you get clear entrainment close to the contact location of 100 hertz, and you get entrainment of 50 hertz at locations far from the contact. And so just to make sure that people understand the setup here, we're inputting energy here, we have measurements here, and then we're placing a simulated PC at each of these locations, and then asking what is its response. And what we find is that we get a clear separation of frequency and space like you would find in that code there, where close to the contact, it's encoding higher frequency information, and then far from the contact, it's encoding lower frequency information. So if we look over the whole hand and generate these entrainment curves for PCs, what we find is that at the contact location, we get back the entrainment curve that we expect. This is a canonical entrainment curve, which has a peak sensitivity between 200 and 300 hertz. But if we try to generate entrainment threshold curves for a PC that was remote to the contact, we get these sort of double peaked behaviors, and actually its peak sensitivity is no longer at 200 hertz. And what we found is that only around 20% of the PCs that we simulated in the hand had peak sensitivities in the canonical range of 200 to 300 hertz, but rather 80% of them had peak sensitivities that were outside that range. And so what we're seeing is that a diverse range of frequencies are able to be encoded at locations away from the contact location. And so let me just do a quick recap. Touch interactions with the world elicit vibrations that spread throughout the hand. These vibrations carry information about the events that elicited them. These vibrations are relevant for perception. The skin modulates and filters these vibrations with distance, similar to how the cochlea decomposes frequency into space. And so this actually allows us a simple set of sensors, which are the PCs, to encode very, very rich information about events that are occurring at the contact location. And these findings have implications for robotics, prosthetics, and haptic devices. And I'm just going to briefly go through two other works that I've done that sort of leverage these waves in the skin. So this is a video of tactile sign language. So individuals who are deaf-blind communicate via touch. And so this is a video of an interpreter signing on the hand of a deaf-blind individual in order to communicate with them. And over here are the, and so the way that this happens is that location and specific types of gestures are actually encoding an alphabet. And so this person is spelling out all these all these letters in order to create words and to communicate with someone who's deaf-blind. And so in this particular work, we designed a bracelet to capture and decode those vibrations that were happening on the hand during tactile signing in order to perhaps build devices for transcribing it. So suppose someone who is deafblind wants to send a remote message to someone. They could sign on their own hand, transmit that information, we decode that, and we could send that around. And so there's a couple of different applications for something like this. But we're really leveraging the fact that that vibrations can be transmitted to the wrist, where we can measure them and decode the information that's happening at the hand. And so in this work, we just did kind of like classical machine learning, where we took a data set by signing on a participant's hand, use those measured acceleration signals at the wrist and decompose them into various sets of features, and then performed just a classical SVM in order to see how well we could predict the letters that would be assigned on the participant's hand. And we got about 93% accuracy in transcribing those letters. And another project was while we were working with waves in the skin, it became really clear that most labs don't have access to these wearable accelerometer arrays or to laser Doppler vibrometers, which are quite expensive pieces of equipment. And it also often took us many, many hours to run participants through these studies. And so we actually designed an open source toolbox that is available to everyone that can help predict vibrations that are happening in the upper limb. And so this toolbox allows you to input arbitrary tactile stimuli at like 1 of 20 locations here, and then gives you the prediction at 72 different locations on the upper limb. And we also have 4 different upper limb models in here. So those were captured data sets from 4 different participants. And I'll just take a quick look at what this kind of looks like. So this is us using our toolbox. We can just input whatever kind of stimulus you want into a particular location that we've sampled, and then you can get the outputs that would be on the upper limb all the way up to the elbow. So another quick little experiment. This is very similar to the last one that we just did, but instead we're going to do it again with a tool. So we're going to put our hands to our ear. You're going to take the pen in your hand and try to use an object, maybe like your phone is pretty good. I think phone or something, and you try to hear it. And it's kind of hard because sometimes the auditory cues will impact your ability to hear what's happening. But the point is that these vibrations are transmitting through this tool that you're using all the way to your wrist. So we get widespread oscillations in the hand that are elicited from a tool. And so you guys can play around with that. We're going to take a quick break here so that everyone can recharge before we go into the second half of the talk. So take like a 5-minute break, I think. All right. We're kind of going to go a lot of places in this talk. So we've done one of these 5 things so far, right? So I said that vibrations transmit information about events happening at the skin to widespread receptors. So I think hopefully I've convinced you that that is the case. Now I want to tell you about how vibrations play an elevated role in tool-mediated touch, and that predictable vibration dynamics of tools and objects are required for effective tool use. And so, in the last experiment, if you tried it with the pen, it's very clear how vibrations were transmitted all the way through the tool, all the way to your wrist, and you can easily hear what was happening. What was happening at the tool environment interface. So when we contact the environment through a tool, information is going to be transmitted along this tool and projected to receptors at the hand. And so at the very beginning of this talk, we agreed that sensations were located, that what we felt like sensations were located at the end of that tool. So your brain told you that contact happened beyond where you have receptors. And to me, this is really, really interesting. We feel like it happens at the end of the tool, but there are no receptors there. And this is partly due to tool embodiment. And so in cortex, there are a specific set of neurons that respond to both visual and tactile stimuli. So I'm going to explain what that is. So suppose we have one of these visual tactile neurons that's associated with the thumb. So it's going to respond to tactile stimulation at the thumb or visual information that's near to the thumb. And the same thing at the elbow. So suppose you have a visual tactile neuron that is associated with the elbow. It's going to respond to tactile stimulation there or visual information that approaches the elbow. And so these neurons will fire for both of those settings. And interestingly enough, they're also anchored to those specific patches of skin. And so if you move your arm that visual receptive field for that neuron is also going to move with you. And so this allows the body to have a representation of near space, which is also known as the peripersonal space. And it's integrating both proprioception, tactile, and vision, right? Because if you move your arm, it's somehow the visual receptive field is also moving with it. And so this is a quite advanced form of multimodal fusion. In this really interesting landmark study by Ariki and co-authors in 1996, they actually measured these visual tactile neurons in cortex of a macaque monkey while it was using a rake and using that rake to bring food towards itself. And what they found was that the visual receptive fields associated with those bimodal neurons expanded to include the tool into its visual receptive field. And so if you looked at one of those visual tactile neurons at the hand, while it was wielding that object, suddenly that visual tactile field is extended towards the tool. And same thing if you had a visual tactile neuron at the elbow, it would be sort of responding to visual stimuli in its general region, and then when you're wielding a tool, it's extended to sort of expand because you're holding this tool. And so the tool was incorporated into the schematic representation of the body. And interestingly enough, the tool needed to be actively used. You couldn't just passively hold it. It wouldn't actually activate an expansion of that visual tactile receptive field. And so unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you think about it, we can't crack into the skulls of our lab mates and measure these visual tactile neurons in cortex. So one way that we can do this is we look for indirect evidence. And so one form of indirect evidence is cross-modal congruency. And so I'm going to explain this study in a little bit more detail because it's kind of confusing. But so basically, in this study, you have a participant who's holding two tools, two rods, and you would apply tactile stimulation to the top of the hand or the bottom of the hand. And then you have a visual distractor at either the top of the tool or the bottom of the tool. And what you find is that when you ask participants to tell you, did you stimulate the top of my hand or the bottom of my hand, which part of your hand was stimulated, top or bottom, it will take much longer to process and respond to that question if you have an incongruent visual stimulation. So if the tooltip shows bottom, but you feel top, it's going to take you much longer to respond that it was at the top of your hand than if they were congruent, and if it was top visual distractor, top of the hand. And similarly, it only happens when it was on the same side of the visual hemisphere. And so if you apply the visual distractor on the right hand, on the right side of the body, when you're asking about the left hand, processing is not really effective. Then this switches when you cross those tools. And so visual stimuli on the right hemisphere are going to be affecting your tactile processing on your left hand. And so what this tells us, or gives us evidence for, is that this visual information is being integrated as part of the left arm's representation of itself. And so that visual information is processed in body-centered coordinates with respect to the hand and not in true 3D coordinate space. And another piece of evidence for this embodiment process is using tactile distance judgment estimates. And so participants are asked to judge the distance of two tactile stimulations on their body before and after tool use. And what they find is that if you thought this distance was 5 centimeters, now you feel like this distance is shorter. This distance is 4 centimeters. And so authors read this as saying that your representation of your own body in the brain is now longer. So it feels, or at least to the brain, your arm is now longer and skinnier. And so it matches this tool after use. And so I'm going to quickly talk about the rubber hand illusion. It's probably going to give us some ads. Oh gosh. There we go.
Okay. It's of interest in the robotics community. How can we extend the human body, not only with advanced prosthetic limbs for amputees, but maybe for exoskeletons? And then, of course, the question is, at what point do these external devices become part of your own body representation? At what point do you start to feel that this is really me?
Sitting in the lab with Henrik and Andreas, one of Henrik's postdocs, I'm about to be put through the rubber hand experiment.
Do most of you know this rubber hand
And then you
illusion?
put your arm here onto the table, and inside is a little box there.
So they hide the hand, and then they synchronously stimulate both your hand and the fake hand on top.
And please look to the index finger of the hand here.
Okay. With my hand hidden from view, Andreas starts to stroke my index finger and the index finger of the rubber hand in almost perfect synchrony.
What's your experience?
I think it is genuinely beginning to become hard to tell whether, I'm beginning to feel like, I'm buying it. That you're swiping that hand. Part of my brain is telling me that it's not possible that that's happening, you know? And then when you're not touching it, I go, no, not happening, and then you touch it. I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling it there. It's totally there.
So I'll keep it short, but I think it's a cool illusion that is related to embodiment, but not exactly embodiment. So the rubber hand illusion is sort of proprioceptive drift of the perceived position of your own hand towards this rubber hand. And it modifies both your the body schematic representation of itself and also the image of your own body. And so you have this sense of ownership over the rubber hand. And this sense of ownership is not required for embodiment. So these tools, if I asked you, does this tool feel like it's part of your body? It doesn't physically feel like it's part of your body, but in some abstract sense, the tool is becoming part of the representation of your body from a neural perspective. But you don't own that tool. And so, keep going. And so when tools are embodied, they become sensory extensions of our. When tools are embodied, they become sensory extensions of our body. And in this study by Miller and co-authors, including Vincent Hayward, who's really a pioneer in haptics, and Alessandro Farnay, they had participants wield a rod, and they would be actively hitting the rod against a block that the experimenter was moving. And what they found is that participants could localize along the entire length of this rod to within about a few centimeters. And while it seems kind of obvious, you're like, oh, humans could do this. From what we know about tool use, it was not evident that you wouldn't have some bias either towards the tip of the tool, so you might think that the contact was towards the tip, or towards your palm. But you actually can localize quite well across the entire length of this object. So in one interpretation of the results, the rod here is the human equivalent of a whisker. And so in mice and rats, these whiskers perform a pre-neuronal process where, based on where this object is contacting the whisker, you're going to get sort of a unique mechanical decomposition at the base of the whisker. And so the whisker is filtering and helping to separate out the stimulus location so that you can more easily and readily encode that for the brain. And so this rigid rod that we're using here is sort of performing a similar thing. It's passively computing for us and encoding contact location into a unique mechanical signal that we can then decode at the hand. And so when we apply forces to this tool somewhere along this object, we're going to get vibrations, right? But we're also going to get, normal and shear forces. We're also going to get torques, right? So it's not just vibrations that are happening when we're applying forces through the hand. But there is an open question of what is the relative importance of each of these while you're performing tool-mediated touch. And in that same work by Miller, they actually demonstrated that each location on this rod has a unique vibratory signature that's related to its modal response. So if you tap here versus here versus here, you're going to get different contributions of the normal nodes, which will create a unique vibration signature that can then be encoding that contact location for the hand. And so if you believe this to be the case, that this is what is allowing us to localize on the rod, you would also have to agree that that's different from how we localize when it's directly on the skin. Right? You would never think that the Pacini and corpuscles are encoding contact location for us on the hand, right? You would think it's the SA ones, the Merkel cells, that are telling us the most information about where things are being contacted on the hand. But here, PCs are sort of elevated to a more privileged channel of information, and if this is true, are encoding contact location where they normally wouldn't be. And to really drive this point home, the authors then performed a final study where they had participants unknowingly wielding a partly rigid and a half non-rigid rod. So they had this wooden rod and then a foam part of the rod. And they asked them to perform that same localization experiment. So they asked them where on this rod is this, where on the rod is this contact happening. What you find is that at the non-rigid end, they have no ability to localize. And so they don't know the difference between any of these three different locations that were spaced about, I believe, 7 centimeters apart, or 10 or so. And then on the rigid rod, interestingly enough, they also estimated incorrectly. And so when they didn't know what the dynamics of this object were, they got the rigid part wrong, which they were fine with before, and they also have no ability to localize on the non-rigid part. And so a key insight from this paper was that humans need predictable and interpretable vibrational dynamics in order for that held object to be felt as a natural sensory extension of itself. And when we break these models, we're going to break our sense, we break embodiment, and we lose the ability to effectively infer information about what's happening between the tool and the environment. And, I have some speculation for you. So I actually speculate that without predictable dynamics, it's hard to use the object as a tool at all. We wouldn't really be using such an object as a tool. So it's probably a coincidence that most tools are rigid links to the environment. I think Catherine said this when she was doing the first part of the experiment, experiment.
Roberto and I disagreed.
So is it a rigid link? Well, I can say this. There is no visually impaired individual who's using a soft polymer cane. That is not the case. It's some form of a rigid object because we need that information to be transferred to us. And so tool-mediated touch requires a model of the tool's vibratory dynamics. We will never reach human-level dexterity without high-resolution vibration sensing. So now we get to the part 4. We're going to bring it all together. And maybe you disagree, maybe you agree. So now we've seen that vibrations transmit information about events happening at the skin to the Weisberg receptors. We found that vibrations play an elevated role in tool-mediated touch. We've also found that predictable vibration dynamics of tools and objects are required for effective use. Now I'm going to try to convince you that inference about the environment through a tool or object is necessary for robot task completion, and that we need new methods for learning vibratory dynamics of tools and objects for robot sensing. So there's this really beautiful review paper from Aude Biard and Danica Krajcik. And in that paper, they talk about what it means to be to reach human level dexterity, to be able to hold multiple objects in the hand, to manipulate them in the hand. But I kept asking myself, grasping for what? What is the point of in-hand manipulation if not to perform some task at the end of the day? And so while the authors obviously recognize that this is a stepping stone towards robots being able to do things in the real world, I really want to highlight that we want robots to perform tasks. And tasks, in tasks, there are tool-like events happening all the time. And so, if this video works, let me see. So here's a shadow hand being teleoperated to insert a USB into a slot. And so all this information happening at the tip of that USB and being inserted into the slot, all of that vibration information needs to be available to the robot, and it needs to be. Sorry for screaming. So it needs to be. So all that information needs to be available to the robot, because all those micro interactions of this USB being inserted into the slot, how do we know when it's exactly aligned? How do we know that when we're sliding it into place? How do we know when we've stopped? All that information is being transmitted as vibrations, and we need to make sure that we're picking those up. And actually, these events are happening all the time in a bunch of robot tasks that we even use as a sort of standardized robot tasks. Yeah?
So the assertion was that you need vibration to do that, right? But there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you don't, right? There's people who've done it from purely visual feedback,
Yes.
from visual-tactile sensor feedback.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So why do we need the vibration?
I don't think I've seen robots be able to perform any of these tasks at speeds that humans can perform. Would you agree with that sentiment?
No.
You would say no?
Yeah, the RL policies run about as fast as people can run.
Okay, well I think that's a fair comment, but I would say that we often use the model of humans and the human hand as inspiration, right?
I don't think we should.
Okay, well I think it's a fair disagreement, and we could have a conversation about it after.
Sure.
Yeah. If you don't think we need normal and shear force sensors or proprioceptive sensors or vibration sensors, then we're just going to have a disagreement. But
No, I don't think that's the position. I think that you were suggesting that for this task, it was necessary. That was
no, I should say. So my next slide goes into exactly that. So to not take my point as stating that it's only necessary sufficient information we need. It is not. But I think that all of these tool-like events, you would agree, are happening in a lot of these tasks, and it would probably be quite useful to have that information in order to make inferences about what's happening. It would probably aid learning, it would probably aid your multimodal representation. Is that a fair, do we agree
So
on
this
that?
is kind of why I'm here. Like, I'm curious to see where the evidence for that is, like a side-by-side comparison of doing it with and without and seeing what happens. Right?
So unfortunately, I have not performed those tasks yet, and I'm just here to provide some evidence why I think vibrations are important. And my point with the tool is that I think there's evidence to support why vibrations are privileged in this particular set of interactions. And maybe an insertion task with a small USB cord is not the best example, but I do think picking and placing, scraping objects along the table, all of these things are encoded. A lot of information, good information, is encoded in vibrations, and it would be, I think, a waste to not be trying to use that information for making differences. So yes, the point made. This is not to imply that vibrations are the end-all, be-all. Grasping, stability, manipulation requires lots of things: normal and shear forces. The robot needs to know where its limbs are, and also the robot needs also to see. And sight is a very important picture part of this problem as well. But I think, and more than happy to disagree with me, I think we need high-resolution vibration sensors in order to sort of reach the next level of robot dexterity. And I think if we take the PC as inspiration, we need to have sensitivities that are as low as around 10 to 100 nanometers. This top curve is that same entrainment threshold curve that we saw before. This bottom curve is actually more of an absolute sensitivity threshold. And so we need these wide bandwidth sensors that are highly sensitive and that are distributed throughout the entirety of the image. And of course, vibration sensing is not new in robotics, so people have been doing this for quite a while. I don't know if this is the first work that was leveraging accelerometers to perform sort of slip detection and graph stability, but it's definitely one of the more famous ones. And so they were using these accelerometers to assess slip. And then there's a more recent work by Jeremy Fischl and Jerry Loeb that uses biotac sensors to perform textural discrimination tasks, and believe that they discriminated over 100 different textures using the biotac sensor, which has a pretty wide bandwidth. And more recently, there's been some work attempting to use vibrations to see beyond the Fingerpad. And so this work in 2016, the authors attempted to localize contacts that were happening through a grasped object using 3 different biotac sensors. And this was they did this using a sort of a classical end-to-end training framework. So you just capture a lot of data, you see if you can predict the contact location from the measured data. And they were able to achieve very good localization performance at around a couple of centimeters. And then in 2021, there was another paper that designed an event-based tactile sensor that could be used to measure high-frequency vibrations. And they demonstrated how you could use these vibration sensors to make inferences about what was happening on a tapped rod, so they could do contact localization. They could also do inference about different types of, I believe it was fruits that were felt through a fork. And I believe they also did an end-to-end training framework, so it was about data capture and then inference on captured data. But I don't think either of these sort of provide us a method towards generalizing and handling unstructured environments, or the varied ways in which these objects might be grasped and interact with the environment. And then there's this really nice work in 2022 that instead of trying to use labeled data, incorporated simulation in the loop. So they digitized over 1,000 different objects and did multimodal simulation on the objects in order to perform a number of different tasks, including scale estimation, contact localization, and shape reconstruction. And the audio generation here in their work is it was done using I believe it was it was done using modal analysis, and in conjunction with the visual and touch information, they were able to get really good performance on all these tasks. And they were, I believe this task in particular was knowing where the robot grasped on a particular object. So this was not sensing through the object, but this kind of modal analysis modeling of vibrations by a digitized object is close to that vibratory dynamics models that I was mentioning. And so before I explain why I believe modal analysis is not a long-term solution to this problem of predicting vibratory dynamics, I want to briefly introduce elastic waves. So motion in elastic waves is described by the elastic wave equation. There's a couple of parameters here. There's shear modulus. This is Lame's first parameter, but you can substitute it out for a material's bulk modulus. And this is describing vector displacement field, so vector motion, and it's a second-order partial differential equation. And so without even including any terms for viscous losses in the system, you actually can get really, really varied and complex wave phenomena that are generated. So this equation admits a number of different types of wave motion. There's compression waves, and so the material is going to compress and rarefact as the waves move along and propagate through the system. And that can happen in any of 3 different directions. You have shearing that can occur, so you have shear waves. They can happen in any of 3 different directions. And so these are the classic P and S waves, if you recall from your seismology class back in the day. Or maybe more recently, if you're interested in structural dynamics. But there's also different types of wave motion that occur at the boundary interface between an object and the environment. So Rayleigh waves have this elliptical motion, and actually these are the type of waves that are propagating in your skin. I put love waves up here just because that was from the reference I had, but there's many, many different types of waves that can be wave motions that are generated on objects, And some of them are very specific to the boundary conditions. So if you have sort of a thin plate, you get what's called Lamb modes, and those are different sets of modes that have different types of shapes. And so all from this one equation, you get really, really complex wave motion. And then, I didn't even include the losses in this equation, but in real systems, you always have losses, you have damping. And so in the human hand, we found earlier that low frequencies transmitted quite far in the hand, but high frequencies stayed localized to the contact. This is an example of frequency-dependent damping, and because the hand was this complex heterogeneous material, it didn't even have a very clean relationship between distance and decay of the wave. And this is a work by Luisa Manfredi from Sleeman-Benz Maya Lab in 2012, where they actually measured the wave speed as a function of frequency in the human hand. What they found was that waves at low frequencies travel much faster than waves at high frequencies. So waves at low frequencies were around maybe 15 to 20 meters per second, but at high frequencies were around 5 meters per second. And so this is an example of dispersion. This is another phenomenon that's really, really prevalent in these elastic wave equations. And so modal analysis is one method for solving the elastic wave equation. It attempts to decompose the wave motion into a sum of independent oscillation modes. So you might have seen these kinds of, maybe in Euler or Bernoulli beam, you would have these classical beam modes that are occurring. But when you change your boundary conditions on an object, you're going to get very, very different modes that are generated. And so if you could imagine doing modal analysis, you would need to do modal analysis either on the fly for the changed boundary conditions, or you would need to sort of have simulated beforehand many, many different ways that the hand or the hand could have been interacting with the object. And so, I think there are a number of challenges for taking simulations of the wave equation and sort of mapping it into the real world. And I actually think this cinder gap that we talk about for vibratory dynamics, I think is closer to a gulf, because these changing boundary conditions are really, really tricky to deal with. It's really hard to get good models for dispersion and damping in real-world materials. Most materials, or at least many materials that we use, are not single homogeneous materials. They have multiple different types of materials that are connected together, and it's not very easy to simulate those types of materials. There's also other phenomena like scattering and diffraction that can happen inside these domains that make predicting, like really getting good predictions of what the vibrations would be on an object, very, very challenging. And so if we just take a step back and try to formalize really what we're interested in doing here, we really want to know about the vibratory dynamics so that we can understand the forces that are happening at the object. So we care about this driving force field. So if we take that elastic wave equation and wrap it into this elastic wave operator L, we can write the equation for forward transport in one of these elastic wave systems as this operator acting on this spatial temporal wave field Y, and that must be equal to the driving forces that are applied to the system. And so we really care about this forward transport, this operator, so that we can make inferences about f of x of t from a limited set of observations at the skin. And so the goal of a framework like this classical inverse problem framework, is to find a forward model L so that you can estimate the forces that generated your observations. And this is typically done by iteratively solving using L, or you can compute a formal inverse and solve directly. And so one method to get these forward models is to just take a lot of data and encode the physics directly using data-driven models from measurements. And so this is actually from our dissertation work, where we captured these elastic wave models using this laser Doppler vibrometer. And this is the video of the forward transport on the wave when we apply an impulsive force here. And so this is like, I believe it's like 2,000 different points on this particular gelatin domain that we applied an impulse here, and we're measuring the forward transport through this particular viscoelastic plate. And it's quite hard to model this, even though it's a very simple domain, because of the challenges of getting good estimates for damping and dispersion in these types of materials. Let's play it one more time. So in my dissertation, a large part of it was designing surface haptic displays. So one of my devices can be seen in the top right here. This is an acrylic plate with these brass rods. There's a story behind why there's a bunch of brass rods in this, but we don't have to worry about that right now. So we have 8 voice coil actuators. And so I use those data-driven elastic wave models in order to understand the driving signals that I need in order to control waves on that plate. And so what I was trying to do was design haptic feedback on this plate. So I could control the wave field so that if people were touching the plate, they would feel specific haptic feedback that I wanted them to at specific locations. So here's a video of me controlling plate waves to generate a localized point of haptic feedback at the center of this plate. And so I capture all my elastic wave models for each of these 8 actuators, and then use those to derive signals to then focus energy to that point. So because you know very clearly about how waves propagate through that system, you can make sure that they all constructively interfere at that particular location, and you can control how waves are the wave field on that plate. And then actually we've seen some of these elastic wave models earlier in this talk. And so this is from the skin source data set that I mentioned very briefly. And so in this work, we actually simulated different locations on the palmar surface of the hand, and we measured with 72 accelerometer arrays. And so we captured about 5,000 impulse responses. And this allows us to reconstruct the vibrations on the hand to different arbitrary inputs at those specific locations that we sampled. So it ends up looking like this. So brief impulse, whole vibration, and that means that we can input any signal we want at that location, assuming some particular linearity assumptions. And so this is a long time-consuming process. So these data-driven methods, while they effectively tell us the forward transport of these systems, are very tricky to capture. They take a lot of time. So the system on the right took about 2 hours per person to capture all the data that we needed for the work. And then on the right, each of these plates took about 12 hours of measurement. So I needed to measure 1,200 locations for each of the points that I wanted to apply forces at. And so in that case, this was 8. This other work, I had 20 different actuators. And so data-driven models also seem pretty challenging to sort of extend to the complex settings that we find in robot interactions. So what are our other options? Well, there's a couple. One is to apply acoustic energy into a system. So active acoustic sensing is something that a couple of people in this room have worked on before. I'm not going to talk about active acoustic sensing here. I'm going to focus on passive methods for trying to understand vibrations that are generated during actual interactions with the environment. And so if we pull from a couple of other different domains, it seems like it's definitely possible to learn forward models in the wild. And this is the case exactly for having a distributed set of sensors, not just 1 or 2 accelerometers, but an array of accelerometers or an array of high-resolution vibration sensors. So in domains like speech separation, sonar, radar, and Wi-Fi, you often have an unknown source or forcing function and an unknown environment. So you have this unknown propagation or forward model in the system. And so those domains often try to do joint estimation of the propagation and forward model and the forcing function. And they do that using various techniques. One of those is typically matrix decompositions on an array of measured signals. So you take your 12, 20, 30 sensors, put it in a matrix, and with a couple of matrix decompositions, using techniques like independent component analysis, you can try to separate out the forcing function from the propagation in the system. And then there are now more modern techniques that are being developed to sort of apply to these settings, such as physics-informed neural networks and surrogate for modeling using techniques like neural radiance fields. And so I know that was kind of like, ooh, a lot of stuff at the end, but it's all really just to say this, that methods in this domain require a number of sensors, high sensor count, in order to be able to separate that source signal, the driving forces that are being applied to the system from the structural dynamics of the system that it's propagating. And so if we want to be able to do things like zero-shot inference about the environment through the grasped object, I really think that the only path forward with these methods is really high-resolution distributed vibration sensing. And so if we want to move beyond the Fingerpad and have robots wield tools as if they were humans, and blur this line between the robot hand and the tool, and with high-resolution vibration sensing, I think we can get to something like this, maybe. It's a little grotesque. Yeah, so what's our time at? We're probably close. That's why I kind of sped up. 35. 35. Okay, so I flew through some of the content, so I apologize. Well, I have another section, so I'm going to just quickly go through some of the work that I'm working on now. Yeah, and I've covered a lot of different ground today, and I really like to thank all my collaborators, and particularly my Ph.D. advisor, Jan Gazelle, and then also my current postdoc advisor at Colgate. Sort of all this work would not be possible without them, and also my collaborators at other institutions, including Hannah Saul, Matteo Bianchi, Tian Shao, and Dr. Chisu. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, that's it for me.